If you're subscribed to this channel, you know I spend a lot of time in Lightroom, and I think it's important that everybody does. It is the digital equivalent of the darkroom. It's where we take our photos to give them our style, our voice. It's where we really embolden the photos, and I think it's important to spend time in there. However, there are certain things that I never do in Lightroom. You can do them in Lightroom, but it is much better to do them in Photoshop. Don't turn this off just because you're scared of Photoshop. I know a lot of people are intimidated by that learning curve and they're like, oh great, I don't want to learn Photoshop. Don't stress it. These things are pretty simple. I'm going to show you how to get them over there. I'm going to show you how to actually perform these tasks pretty quickly and easily. And even if you don't want to learn the rest of what Photoshop can do, these are 5 things that you don't want to do in Lightroom that you want to do in Photoshop instead, and how to do them. So with that, let's get into it. So before we get into the 5 things, I want to very quickly show you how to get a photo from Lightroom into Photoshop very easily. All you have to do is right click, go edit in, Adobe Photoshop. And that's it. So it's a very easy transition, and the good thing is once you've saved it in Photoshop, it will automatically save an example back in Lightroom. So we'll go through that in practice as we come through, but I wanted to open with that. So the first thing I suggest not doing in Lightroom that can technically be done in Lightroom is spot removal and healing. And what I mean by that, this one's a pretty obvious example. It's got these, looks like a hair was on my sensor and a lot of spray had hit the polarizing filter I was using for this. So you can see spots everywhere. Now Lightroom does have the spot removal feature. If you click right there, it's got this other great little add-on feature, Visualize Spots, that allows us to see where the spots are that we need to fix. So you can see there's quite a few here. You can kind of see this hair, and it's got this little slider that allows you to sort of visualize easier. So there's it's a handy technique. You know, you drag it up to where you need to be, and I can see all these spots. So I can literally just start clicking. The problem with doing this in Lightroom is it tends to choose really weird areas, and it doesn't do a very good job of healing that. I mean, that's worse than the spot was. And we can try the clone instead of the heal, but it's not doing a very good job of that either. Now, technically, maybe I'm supposed to drag. Let's see, I'm going to do one over here. I can drag where it's sampling from if I don't like the location. So if I didn't like that, maybe I thought this was a better spot. The problem is when you have a lot of these to go through, it is time consuming, and you'll find that your processor starts to really drag. Lightroom becomes really slow as you get a bunch of these going. So I prefer to take this over to Photoshop. And the way we did that, as I showed you, just right click, edit in, Adobe Photoshop. Now it came up with this what to edit thing. Do you want to edit a copy of Lightroom adjustments? So I usually click yes to that. What it's asking is, do you want to edit the original photo or this one that you're currently at with all the changes you've made in Lightroom? So most of the time I want to edit the one that I'm currently working on in Lightroom, so I hit edit. So here we are in Photoshop. It has loaded our image, and we want to heal all these spots. So the first thing I almost always do is just Command J. That duplicates the layer. And the reason I do that is, let's say I make some changes that I don't like. I can always just delete the layer and go back. And what I mean by that, let's say that I accidentally, I don't know, made a mess of things. I'll heal that. So yeah, let's say that I had made a mess of things. I want to start over. I can always just click on the layer 1, hit the delete key, and I have my background. I can start over, Command J. So I always work on a secondary layer. That's the first thing I would note in Photoshop. The first thing you need to do is click on your spot healing brush tool, or you can use hotkey J. And this is just going to help us fix those spots very quickly and easily. There's a lot of ways to fix spots and to eliminate things in Photoshop, but I'm going to take you through the quick, easy way. Use the bracket keys to make the size of your brush a bit smaller, usually just a little bit bigger than the item you're deleting, and just click on it. It's as easy as that, and it does a much better job of sampling. Now, we don't have the visualize spots feature, but what we can do is if you click the levels adjustment and drag up from this end and down from the midtones here, and just create a ton of contrast, and sort of keep an eye on your sky, you'll see that those sensor spots and the hair and the stuff that was on your lens start to really show. So what I do is click back on layer 1, zoom in. Once we're zoomed in, we can see very clearly where the spots we need to fix are. So I'm just clicking and dragging, click, 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 and you can see that it's doing a really good job removing these sensor spots. And that's just a much faster, easier way than using the spot tool in Lightroom, and it's not going to slow your computer down as much. When you're done, just click on the levels adjustment layer and hit the delete key so that it's no longer giving you that weird coloration, but your spots will stay fixed. The last thing I always do is right click, flatten image. This compresses all the layers to make it a small file again. Go File, Save, and we're done in Photoshop. It was just that easy. And what you'll see next, as soon as the saving status is done, is it's going to be available for us immediately in Lightroom. So let's go ahead and head over there. If I hit the I key, you can see that it saved it as a TIFF. It has fixed the hair and all that, and at this point I could keep working, I could export it, but I would be all done if I had actually gone through and clicked on all those things. So here's another example of a time when Lightroom has the removal tool, the healing tool, spot removal they call it, but maybe I want to get rid of this whole beam. I find this distracting down here. It pulls my eyes away from everything else that's going on in the image. So if I try to use the Lightroom tool and just click and drag down it, it sampled from here. That was a better selection than it usually makes, but it still doesn't exactly look right. So if I need to move this, and maybe I can go over here, and I don't know. It's certainly not clean. It's not easy. I could try the clone tool instead by clicking up here, going between clone and heal. Neither's doing a very good job. Sometimes it works if you're lucky, but it's just not reliable. It's not elegant. So again, this is an example where I would first I'm going to reset it, so I have it there in full. File, edit in Photoshop. So with that open in Photoshop, all I do is go to the spot healing tool. Now I could make another layer if I wanted to, like I showed you for the last one, and probably should, usually would, but just for time's sake, if I just click and drag over everything I want to be gone, make sure it's all selected, and does a pretty good job. Now I do the bit that was missing. If I see some spots that don't quite look right, I just do it again. And I can kind of just keep going very quickly and easily. Photoshop will do a pretty good job of making that look natural. So by the end, if I zoom out, it all looks pretty clean. And imagine like something, for example, like this spire in Lightroom being almost impossible to get rid of. But in Photoshop, because it does a good job sampling, that looks pretty natural. Like you would have to spend a bit of time really fine-tuning it, but there, I mean, if I zoomed out, you wouldn't know that there was ever a spire there. And again, all we'd have to do once we have our spots or our objects or whatever removed is go save, and it will take it back over to Lightroom for it in the form of a TIFF. All right, the next thing that you can do in Lightroom in a lot of different ways, but that I often like to do in Photoshop is called dodging and burning. And that essentially means brightening and darkening certain areas of the photo. So here we have a shot of Pearson Falls in Oregon, and it's fine, it's nice. It's not very, there's not a lot of contrast. It's not very grabbing. And I would do some dodging and burning. So the options you would have in Lightroom is to use the brush tool, and you could sort of paint along places and then just increase the exposure. And that works, well. It's okay. It's not ineffective. But Photoshop has some ability to target very selectively, very tactically, the highlights, the shadows, the midtones, certain colors, and dodge and burn based on that, which is going to provide a much better method of dodging and burning. So let me show you how to do that. So in Photoshop, first thing I'm going to do, as always, Command J, duplicate my layer, and I'm going to come down to this little tool set here. So if you right click, you'll see you actually have three options: dodge, which is going to brighten; burn, which is going to darken; and sponge, which is either going to saturate or desaturate. So if I start with the dodge tool, the reason I think it's a lot better than Lightroom is, first of all, it's quicker and easier, but you have this range up here where we can target shadows, midtones, or highlights. So as an example, you usually want to dodge or brighten your highlights and maybe your midtones, and you usually want to burn or darken your shadows to create some nice contrast. So in this image, I'm going to start with the midtones because the highlights are going to be the white water mostly. Some of these greens will probably fall into highlights, and I don't necessarily want to make the water any brighter. So usually the midtones are where I'm focusing, and I'm just going to sort of click and drag around here. Now if that's too strong or too weak, you can adjust the strength of the dodging tool by just dragging the slider, the exposure slider here. I usually find that starting between 5 and 10 is good, sometimes even more subtle. Subtlety is key. And I'm just going to go around sort of bringing out some of the vibrant greens in certain places. And the idea is that by having some spots that are just slightly brighter, we're going to draw gaze there, and the contrast is just pretty pleasing. So first thing I'm going to do is find some areas to go around, kind of brightening semi at random. You just develop an eye for this. There isn't a rule, but you start to learn what looks good. And the next thing I'm going to do is burn a little bit. So if I go to my burn tool, I'm going to have this at shadows. 6 is fine. Maybe I'll go down to 5 just in case. Again, I find that the between 1 and 10 range is pretty much where I live. And I'm going to sort of go anywhere that there aren't highlights, basically. Now, again, this is just my personal style. I like lots of contrast. So I don't think we need to see detail in every level of the photo. I want to make the brights pop, and I want to make the darks complement the brights is essentially my goal. So I'm just kind of going around darkening anything that I think is not necessarily disinteresting, but draws attention away from the points of interest, and looking to just create some contrast here. And the next thing I'm going to do is use my sponge tool. I'm going to have it on saturate. I'm going to increase this a little bit, but again, there isn't a rule to any of this. It's just sort of learning by doing. And I'm going to saturate the greens here in the middle. I want most of the attention to be kept kind of in this area, with everything else is complementary to that. So in fact, I'm going to desaturate the outside a bit. So I'm going to go desaturate and take down some of these bright colors on the outside. That will draw attention away from the center, which is where I want to keep attention. And I'm actually going to increase the desaturation because it's not doing quite as much as I had hoped, and desaturate some of these outside areas. All right, so just like that, with a few clicks and drags, if I turn that layer, by the way, if you just click this eyeball, you can turn the layer on and off, basically. So by doing that, you can see the changes we've made by dodging and burning, and it's really done a good job of making the highlights pop and the colors you want pop and drawing attention. Everything we see is now in this area. When we're done, flatten image, file save, and we're done. I wanted to show you one more example of what makes the dodging and burning tools in Photoshop so effective. So this image is nice, but it needs more contrast. It needs a bit of drama brought to it, in my opinion. So I'm going to start by going to the dodge tool, and I'm going to start with the midtones. 8 feels good, and then again, you can increase your brush sizes with the bracket keys in Photoshop. And I'm going to sort of brighten areas that are already bright. And the thing is, you don't have to be too precise when you're using this tool. That's what makes this range mask so good, is it automatically will ignore, for example, the shadows, and it will focus on the midtones so that you're not brightening the wrong thing. It helps to create that natural contrast. So I'm going to places that already have a bit of sunlight, and then I'm actually going to go to the highlights tool. I'm going to lower this a bit because that will get pretty dramatic. I just know that from experience. 3 sounds good. And I'm going to do a pretty similar thing and go for the areas that already have some contrast. Anywhere that I'm seeing some sunlight breaking through, I'm just sort of painting. And you do this to taste. I like a lot of drama. I'm even going to get her dress. And what that does is it leaves the shadowy bits dark and brightens the rest. So it really gives that idea of the sheer material catching sunlight as it passes through. And if we turn just this on and off, we've already made a massive difference to the photo. And depending on what you like and how you want to do it, you would then probably go into your burn tool and you would start to increase or deepen the shadows a bit. So maybe, especially back here where there isn't sunlight, I'm just going to go through and paint some of the shadows. Usually around the edges is where you want to make the darkest parts of your image. You don't want to darken too much in the center, generally speaking, but that's up to you and your style. Next thing I'm going to do in this case is just do a few midtone changes, and I'm going to bring that exposure up to, say, 8. I'm going to come back over her dress a bit and add a bit of fire there, brighten her face a little bit, and sort of here where there's some sunlight but not as much, I don't want it quite so dark, so I'm just painting along this edge that's catching. Maybe some there too. So if I turn that on and off, it's already made a huge difference. It's created some drama, some contrast, but you might say, well, that's overdone. Well, the good thing is, go back to dodge, turn on your highlights, and maybe we're going to take this back down a little bit. So that's it. That's another example of why dodging and burning I find to be a much more effective method in Photoshop. Those first 2 things I showed you were things you can do in Lightroom, but I find more effective in Photoshop. This next one I'm going to go through, you can kind of technically do in Lightroom. It's called transforming, but man, these tools down here are almost worthless in my opinion. If I want to stretch this image, let's say I want to turn this into a Instagram orientation of 4x5. I want to literally transform this to be taller than it is wide, which I often do because a lot of my photos I take landscape, but for Instagram, Facebook, for digital media these days, you want them in a portrait orientation. If I try to transform anything, say the vertical, it does some real weird stretching and skewing. I could hit constrain crop, and I'd have to do all sorts of stuff to, I guess, don't even honestly know how to use this tool. I find it so ineffective that I've never once done anything successfully in Lightroom. Automatically, I'm going to take a photo like this into Photoshop, and I do this for a couple of reasons. One, because of the wide angle, this back waterfall, which is actually significantly larger than, say, this tier, look small. That's wide angle distortion. I might want to bring that back to scale. Or like I said, I might want to stretch this whole thing to fit a vertical format. So we're going to go edit in Photoshop, and away we go. Right, so here we are in Photoshop, and as always, the first thing we do, Command J to duplicate our layer, make sure we're not working off the background. And in this case, what I'm going to do is transform the image using Command T, T for tiger, or, T for transform. And the next thing I want to do is make sure that this link is not on, because that's going to make sure that your width and your height always match, and we don't want that. We're trying to transform this. We're going to stretch this along the vertical axis. So there's a couple ways to do it. If you just want to stretch everything proportionally, all you have to do is put in a height percentage. So for example, I'm going to put 125, and I'm going to hit the Enter key, or the checkbox, I suppose, in this case. And it's going to go ahead and apply that transformation. Now, obviously, we've gone outside the scope of our boundaries of our 3:2 ratio. If you needed to maintain that 3:2 ratio, then you would leave it here. You'd go File Save, or I guess first you'd want to flatten the image, and then you'd go File Save. But let's say that you don't want to maintain this ratio. Let's say we're going to make this a square. What I'll do first is Command minus a couple times so that I've zoomed out and I have more space to work with. So what we're going to do is go to the Crop tool, and if you have numbers in here, you'll need to hit the Clear key and then go out of it and come back into it. Just click on, say, the Move tool and come back. If it's already clear, great. All we do is drag up from the bumpers, and it should lock into position where the new boundaries exist. So right about there and there. And that's it. I find that a much more effective way to stretch and transform an image. And the good thing is you can actually be more selective with it. So for example, this might be getting too advanced for some of you, but I'm going to go through it quickly in this video, and I'll do a full video on this at a later date about how to transform an image shot in landscape to a 4:5 Instagram or Facebook ratio, because I know I do that a lot and some people want to. But just in this particular case, use the rectangular marquee tool and just click and drag. And I'm going to stop it about there. I'm going to hit the Command J hotkeys again, which has saved that selection as a new layer. And then what I'm going to do, with that layer selected, Command T, and you can see now it's only using that layer. If I just click and drag, I can stretch just that top part and give that a lot more scale back and fix it, the wide angle distortion. So again, I'll click the Crop tool. I will increase the crop of my image, and there we go. I've transformed this waterfall now to have much bigger, more impressive tears. It looks a bit closer to what it did like in real life because we don't have the wide angle distortion. And if you want to see where we've started and ended, that was just that last transformation. And you can see it's really stretched and pulled these waterfalls in a nice way. And this is where we started. So if we were done, we would have all the layers on. We would just right click, flatten image, file, save. We're back in Lightroom. The fourth thing that I always do in Photoshop is something you can't even quite do in Lightroom at all, and it's the dust and scratch tool. It's a form of denoising. I use it all the time for my night photography because you get these hot pixels and these spots that are just really hard to clean up. The only thing Lightroom has for you is a luminance slider, but that doesn't really address the spots. In fact, it almost accentuates them, which is obviously not ideal. But there's a tool in Photoshop that's really effective for battling this. So let's go. First, I'm going to reset that because I don't want what it did. You can see, again, these are just everywhere. So File, Edit in Photoshop. Now, if you guessed we were going to start with Command J, this time you're actually kind of wrong, though I will say there is a much more advanced technique I use to do what I'm about to show you that makes it more selective, okay? But I don't want this to be a Photoshop tutorial. I just want you to know a few basic tools in Photoshop. And with that in mind, I'm not going to do the advanced method. I'm going to show you the simple method of removing all those hot pixels and some of the noise in our foreground here. So if we zoom in tight, let's get a good look at it. It is everywhere and it is offensive. Very easy fix that's not available in Lightroom. If you go to Filter, Noise, and click Dust and Scratches. Now there's a lot of different denoising techniques, and some of these are good in certain situations. What I've found is Dust and Scratches is great for this particular thing. Put the radius at 1 and the threshold at 0. And look, they're all gone already, just like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit cancel so you can see them again. I am going to hit Command J just for visualization's sake. I'm going to call this layer denoised, and I'm going to leave the other one as background. So again, filter, noise, dust and scratches, put the radius to 1 and the threshold to 0. Now, what you can do is drag this threshold up, and let's go extreme just so you can see first. It's going to introduce detail, but again, it's going to reintroduce a lot of those dust and scratches. So what you might want to do is try dragging up a little bit until you see the problem starting again. So basically, what's the best we can get away with before we start to see those hot pixels and that noise coming back? And I'm going to say probably about 25. Now it depends. This might already look too noisy for you, but you have to remember we are zoomed in to like, way more than you would ever actually be zoomed in. So let's leave it at 25. And I'm going to show you the before and after. So all it's done is it's kept all the detail, but it's gotten rid of all those hot pixels, which is just so helpful. So all we have to do is flatten that image, file save, and we're back into Lightroom processing our photo. This one's going to require a bit more understanding of Photoshop. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. Now, I'm going to try to make it simple, but some of you may not be able to keep up, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged. It just means you might actually have to put a bit more time into Photoshop. But at least you will see a reason to learn Photoshop, and one of the things that makes it so powerful. If nothing else, even if you can't follow along, at least it sort of gives you some insight as to why you would want to learn that software a little bit. Now, Lightroom gives us these awesome HSL sliders, which, by the way, you might have sorted like this. You can switch back and forth based on how you want to have that set up by just clicking color or HSL, but regardless of which one you're in, the problem I have, and I really wish Lightroom would fix this, is that they only allow this for global. So, for example, I want to move the blue luminance way down, and this is going to come up the most often with blue because you'll find things show blue that you didn't realize did. I didn't think there was so much blue in the snow. I definitely didn't think there was any blue in his mane. I didn't recognize that as being a blue tone at all. I was mostly trying to make this sky dark so that I could bring out contrast in our beautiful horse here. And then maybe I was going to come up a bit with the orange saturation and use that juxtaposition, that color contrast. But I don't like what it's done to his mane and to some of the snow. So what can I do? Well, in Lightroom, I can't really do anything. I could come back up and I could try to use different local adjustments, maybe a brush to only paint the sky and then lower that and do this or that, but it's not very elegant and there's times where it's not effective. I'm going to take it into Lightroom and, into Photoshop, and we're going to finish in there. And as always, Command J, let's duplicate, whoops, first I have to click on it, Command J, and we're going to duplicate that layer. So what's cool about Photoshop is you actually have the ability to use it just like Lightroom. And what I mean is you go to Filter and go down to Camera Raw Filter, you essentially have Lightroom built into Photoshop. Anything you can do in Lightroom, you can do here in Photoshop. Plus, Photoshop offers a lot more. Now, the reason I still prefer to start my workflow in Lightroom is it's all quicker and it's more elegant and there's a lot better hotkeys and stuff like that. But technically speaking, all the same options do exist somewhere within this. But we're just going to focus on the HSL panel, which is down here in Color Mixer. And what I was showing you before is if I wanted to take those blues all the way down, you can see it's the exact same effect and everything. I'm going to hit OK. So here's where it gets a bit complicated. What makes Photoshop so powerful is it allows you to make really selective, fine-tuned tactical adjustments. The blue that I mentioned I didn't want to show in the mane and maybe in the snow, and basically in the horse at all. I only wanted it in the sky and maybe the deepness of the shadows here of the mountains. So what I can do is I can create a new layer mask. I do that by just clicking down here where it says Add Layer Mask. And what that's going to allow me to do is imagine that these two layers are actual photographs stacked on top of each other. The photograph on the bottom did not have that blue luminance adjustment, and the photograph on the top did. What I'm going to do with this mask, I'm going to show the layer underneath only where I want it to show through. So what we do is, with that layer mask selected, you go to your brush tool, and you need to make sure that you are painting the black color onto the white mask. So why is that? Well, essentially, if you think of the white as a wall, so white wall, anywhere you paint black is going to be a window down to the background layer. So with that done, make sure your opacity and your flow and everything is set to 100. And you can control the size of your brush by using the bracket keys. So I'll show you the hotkeys down there at the bottom of the video. I'm going to get a pretty decent one. If you need to control the hardness, you do that up here in the brush options. So this is where, again, it gets a bit technical. Eventually, you'll use layers and masking all the time. It's what makes Photoshop as powerful as it is the layer masking tools. I'm going to make the hardness, say, 25. That's essentially feathering, same thing, different word. And I'm just going to paint along the places I don't want to have that blue showing through. Now, you can see I went too far, so I have two options. I can either Command Z to undo, or I can now go back to white because there's black that's been painted onto white here. I can paint it back white and fix that. And then just using these arrows, I'm going back to black, and I'm just going to paint my horse. Now, I also wanted the snow, so I'm going to get a much bigger brush, and I'm just going to brush through here. and I'll get all of the horsey. And I don't mind that it bleeds over a bit there because that looks natural. So if I turn off the background layer, you're going to see everywhere that I've painted in black is showing through. So maybe I can refine that more because I want all the horse. So let's just do that. And there we go. I have basically hidden, I'm going to call this blue loom layer, which is where I made my blue adjustment. I have hidden that layer anywhere I've painted black, revealing instead the background layer. And by doing that, I've allowed myself to selectively color tone just the spots I want. This can be really powerful when you have shades that appear in different places on your photograph. So blues are common. Maybe you had a red sunset and red wildflowers, and you wanted to affect the tones of the red in your sky differently than the tones of the red in the wildflowers, or vice versa. A lot of times, this will come up with greens as well. This method allows you to just selectively tone the areas you want. And it takes a bit of practice, but it's going to transform the way you do photography when you eventually learn layers and masking in Photoshop, because there is 1,000 applications for using this exact technique that we just did. Last thing we want to do, flatten image. Now that that's done, we're going to go to File, Save, and it's saving it for us, and that will appear back in Lightroom as soon as that saving bar is done. So that's it, guys. We are done with another lesson. I hope you found it educational, valuable. I hope it maybe helped you overcome that fear of getting into Photoshop if you had that still. And I want to thank Matt, who is one of my first subscribers and is always leaving comments, sending messages, because he's the one who came up with this idea of things he should not be doing in Lightroom. And I thought it was really good. And I also want to mention that because I would love to hear from you. If you thought this was terrible, say it nicely. Let me know how I can improve, and I would really appreciate that. If you think it was great, I like that too. If you have ideas for what you'd like to see, help me know who you are, who I'm here to serve. And, just like Matt's suggestion, might become a video in a week. So let me know in the comments, and I'm going to leave a few other links popping up somewhere around here to check out that I think are also really relevant. If you like this one, there are going to be other similar type of videos to help you transform your images in Lightroom. And that's it for me, guys. Hope to see you in the next one.